Okay. I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. First of all, welcome everyone to our fortnightly seminar. Hope everyone's doing good during this lockdown. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome the Deputy Director for City Futures, Scientia Associate Professor Hazel Easthope. Hazel needs no introduction within CFRC, and she has been in the forefront of City Futures research in the development management, governance, and planning implications of private apartment buildings and experiences of the residents. Today, I'm looking forward to a talk on apartments, their governance, redevelopment, and implications for the city. And without further ado, over to you, Hazel.
Thanks very much, Bala. Let's get the presentation up.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for having me to present today. So my presentation today is based on a book chapter that Bill Randolph and I wrote together. And basically the chapter and this presentation is about what we can and should do with old apartment buildings, especially those that are owned by multiple people at once, like condominiums and strata title. So obviously this issue is super topical right now with the Miami building collapse, hence my picture choice for the opening slide. But it's been a concern internationally for quite some time. And there are also implications here for how we think about what we're building now. What's the build quality like? How long will it last? What maintenance will it need to stay safe? And what are the options when it needs upgrading? But in this presentation, I'm going to focus just on what to do with the old buildings. So we took the findings of a research project on the potential for renewal of strata buildings, which is what we call condominium in Australia, across Sydney as a starting point. And we mulled over the implications of what we found in that study and used that to point to some alternative approaches to apartment renewal in the chapter and hence in this presentation. And so the pictures on the slide here are the team from that study, and I'd like to acknowledge those team members. So in addition to Bill, they were Lawrence Troy, Simon Pinniger, and Laura Cromlin, who'll be familiar faces to many of you. So this area is an important part of my own research agenda moving forward too. And I'm also going to mention some current projects that I'm working on with colleagues in this space. So for those of you at City Futures who aren't really familiar with my research, hopefully this will give you a bit of an introduction to what I'm working on at the moment as well. So what is this thing, condominium redevelopment? Essentially, we're talking about redevelopment of apartment buildings that are owned privately by multiple property owners. And that redevelopment can take different forms. And someone else is now in control of the presentation and I can't see my presentation notes. Vala, can you help me with that?
So there is a button on the top which says
yeah, okay, I've got it back. Excellent. Okay, so when I talk about redevelopment, there's different forms that can take. Often we talk about the complete demolition and then the rebuilding of a building. But sometimes it might be a substantial upgrade. So we might be talking about the addition of new units, digging out basements, or replacing and rebuilding walls. And redevelopment could be triggered by a lot of different things. It can be managed and promoted by different people, and it can be funded in different ways. So here's a go at a simple summary at the drivers of redevelopment. Essentially, there's four main triggers. A profit motive, so where there's the potential for profit through redevelopment, rezoning to higher densities, a significant maintenance cost. Often we see these redevelopments being prompted by a large maintenance cost that would be unmanageable for owners to cover, and quality of life considerations. And the proponents of redevelopment can be the unit owners themselves, governments, and also external investors. And somebody is clicking. It's all right, I've got you. Okay, so what's so different about condominiums? Why are we talking about condominium redevelopment and not just apartment building redevelopment? The simple answer is because they have lots of owners, normally as many owners as there are units. And also in Australia, almost all private apartment buildings are strata titled or condominium buildings. So they're basically one and the same thing here. But they provide a particularly complex or tricky case to look at the issues of redevelopment. So one of the biggest challenges with condominiums or strata is how to renew them at the end of their physical and economic life. And compared to apartment buildings owned by a single landlord, multi-owned buildings require much more complex arrangements to undertake significant renovations or to be demolished and rebuilt. So how can redevelopment be realised? We see it through collective sale, which means all of the units are sold together as one to a developer. Sometimes the developer might approach an owners corporation to propose this, and sometimes an owners corporation will put their property on the market. We also see it through rebuilding, which can be demolition and rebuild or a substantial upgrade. And sometimes that's entirely owner-led, where owners do the redevelopment themselves, but not often. Sometimes it's entirely developer-led, where owners have no input, and sometimes it's a hybrid. And I'm going to talk to you a bit more about some of those hybrids later on in the presentation. So sometimes we see rebuilding after a collective sale, and sometimes there's no collective sale and the owners become the developers collectively. And there's also lots of other things that go on in the background too. So for example, we often see incremental purchase of units. So sometimes this is covert, where an individual or a developer tries to buy multiple units in a building, perhaps through friends and family or through shell companies to try and get a major stake in order to vote through a redevelopment. And sometimes it's overt, where owners might buy out other owners in the unit, in the building who aren't interested in a redevelopment. And we see a blurring of lines here between owners and investors. Some owners are acting like speculative investors, buying out their neighbours. So far I've been talking about individual buildings or estates that are all under a single management structure, but I also wanted to point out that these types of redevelopments can occur where a series of buildings side by side are sold in a line. And we're starting to see more of this in Sydney. And on the slide, this is taken from realestate.com.au, and this is taken from an advertisement for a land lot where we see a combination of strata buildings being sold in a line. And Laura, Simon and I are working on another research project right now, which is looking at these types of multi-building collective sales. And we're looking at them both for strata buildings and for detached houses. So there was the word governance in the title to this presentation. What's all this got to do with governance, you might ask? So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to touch on two governance issues. The first is the impact of condominium governance on redevelopment options and outcomes. And the second is the potential impact of different types of redevelopment on the governance of future condominiums and the broader implications of that for the future of cities. So I said that the chapter took as its starting point a research project called Renewing the Compact City. And as part of that research project, we conducted a survey with owners and renters who were living in blocks that were built before 1990. So it was a survey that was conducted in mid-2014, and we sent survey packages to a random sample of 15,000 addresses in 8,700 buildings across Sydney, which was stratified by development size and date of registration in order to get that response. And then we also used a modified development feasibility model to assess the economic potential of renewal under prevailing market conditions for all of the pre-1990 strata properties that had 3 or more units across Sydney. And I'll show you the results of that shortly. So in the Renewing the Compact City project, we focused on what we call in our chapter the business as usual approach to condominium redevelopment, because this seems to be the most common way that condominiums are redeveloped, both in Australia and internationally. The basic equation in this form of renewal is that the increased value of the new building offsets the costs of demolition and rebuilding with enough profit margin to reward the risks that are involved. So normally what that means is that we're replacing low-rise with high-rise buildings, or we're replacing more affordable with more expensive units. And in a lot of jurisdictions, governments have amended the law to try and make this type of redevelopment easier, typically by reducing the proportion of owners who have to agree to redevelopment before it can happen. And examples of countries that have done that are Japan, Singapore, and a number of states and provinces in Canada, the US and Australia. So in New South Wales, only 75% of owners need to agree to this type of redevelopment. And an important reason and an important justification for these new laws is the real and imagined governance challenges associated with owner-led redevelopment in a multi-owned building or complex. So why is this the usual approach? The short answer is that the alternatives are even more challenging. There are contrasting attitudes in any negotiation over renewal that reflect interests and aspirations and the economic and information resources and decision-making power of the people who are involved. So we see differences between renters, owner-occupiers and investor owners. We see differences between owners who bought into the building at different times, between people who want to stay in the area and those who don't want to stay in the area, between planning authorities who are promoting density and mixed use and residents, and also lots of other conflicts and differences. And collective sale and developer-led redevelopment is already complicated and means that many factors need to be considered. And owner-led redevelopment adds a layer of complexity to that. So the other factors that need to be considered are collating detailed information about the site, buildings, planning controls, property values, defining owner priorities, identifying... Sorry about that noise, that was my cat using his litter. It was me, Rupa. So the factors that need to be considered are collating detailed information about the site, buildings, planning controls, property values, defining owner priorities, identifying options and assessing their feasibility, organising project finance, managing development risks and insurance, and all of that before actually coming to the point where owners can vote and agree on what to do next. So as you can see, it can be complicated. So now we know what the business as usual approach is and why it's the business as usual approach. What are the implications of it for cities? So Bill and I identified three major ones in the chapter, and I'm going to talk about each of those now before turning to talk about what the alternatives might be. So the first implication is decreasing governance capacity and increasing governance challenges. So in the survey that we did for the Renewing the Compact City project, most owner-occupiers wanted to keep living in their local area, and many also wanted the option of owning a unit in the new building if their building was redeveloped. And I think that's promising because if owners remain involved in a condominium before, during and after its redevelopment, they're likely to have built up some organisational and social capital through the experience, and they're likely to be better placed to govern their condominium in the future. But where the original owners don't remain involved in the governance, the new condominium will be faced with an entirely new condominium corporation that'll have to be built up from scratch. And that's what normally happens with the business as usual approach. And then on top of that, we see the displacement of renters. So that's likely to have a negative impact on local social cohesion. And it's an especially big problem in Australia because we know that about half of all residents in strata properties are renters. And we know that Australia has very poor rental controls for private renters compared to other international examples. Redevelopment also often results in larger and more complex condominium corporations, which brings more challenges to owner-led condominium governance. And we see this with mixed-use redevelopments and also complex nested management structures that involve multiple condominium associations under an umbrella association. The second implication is increasing socio-spatial polarization or increasing inequality across cities. Owners who sell in these situations will have choice in where they move, but for renters, the prospects are usually much less favourable, especially where we're seeing higher value or more luxury units replacing lower value or more affordable ones. And our research suggested their trajectory would be into more distant and lower value suburbs. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. The third implication is that there'll be limits to future renewal through increasing land fragmentation. So the business as usual approach often results in larger developments, and that in turn means that the land is divided up into more parcels of ownership. And given the difficulties of getting unit owners to agree to redevelop in, say, a 12-unit building, increasing the number of owners on that same block of land poses a long-term challenge for future renewal of those newer buildings. So in support of those previous 2 points, I wanted to talk you through the feasibility analysis that I mentioned before. So Lawrence Troy did the work behind this feasibility analysis with a lot of input from Bill. And in developing the feasibility model, Lawrence estimated the cost of redeveloping the parcel of land for each strata building type. And we divided them into walk-up, which is up to 3 stories, and high-rise, which is 4 or more stories. And also at different building qualities, so basic, medium, and high finish. Based on the profile of each block, based on its size, age, and land area, together with the current new build median sales price for units in the local area and the construction costs. The cost of assembling the lots on each land parcel was estimated based on the market prices of the existing units in the neighbourhood. And basically what the model does is it estimates the capacity of every single strata scheme, each site, to be redeveloped across Sydney. So these are all of the pre-1990 buildings. And so this is a map of Sydney. You can see, I think the pointer will work here. This is Sydney City. This is the harbour, Northern Beaches, North Shore, Eastern Suburb. And then this is Parramatta up here at the end of the river. So each of those black dots is a strata scheme that was registered prior to 1990. And what we were able to do was we were able to allocate an outcome to each of those strata schemes in terms of the feasibility of their redevelopment. So this shows where it's feasible to knock down the existing strata scheme and replace it with a strata scheme of up to 3 stories at a basic finish level. So each of those dots are places, individual property sites where that's possible. This one shows the same but at a medium finish, and this one at a high finish. And then we put them all on top of each other. So if they're feasible at the lower price point, then that's the dot that's included. So basically the lower price dot takes precedence. Then we've also mapped the maybes and the no's, and the NAs are the ones, those blue dots are ones where it would actually cost more. So it's not that you wouldn't get a development profit, but you would actually make a loss if you tried to redevelop in that way. So then we did the same, then we put all of them on top of each other, and you can see here the map of all of those walk-up flats outcomes. And what's important here is that we see high finish redevelopments are feasible. So this is the dark green in the most expensive parts of the city. So this is the CBD, this is the North Shore, the Northern Beaches, and the eastern suburbs. So what that means is we're seeing low-rise strata blocks being replaced with other low-rise strata blocks, but at a very high finish. We then did the same thing for high-rise flats. So for if it's feasible to build 4 or more stories, and again, if it was feasible at 3 or less stories, that's the dot that's marked. So these are the ones where it wasn't feasible at 3 or less, but it is feasible at 4 or more. And what we start to see here is a swathe of basic and medium quality redevelopments that are feasible through these middle suburb areas. So that's the light and medium green colours. And also, of course, we see that high quality high rise is feasible in those wealthy areas as well. And this is the map with everything on it, and we had to change the colours a bit so that you could actually distinguish between all the different areas. But I popped this map in because I also wanted to draw attention to these red and blue, and also pockets here. These are the schemes, the strata developments that are not feasible to redevelop. So to summarise what those maps tell us, they tell us that there's 3 likely outcomes in terms of knockdown and rebuild in Sydney. The first is gentrification, which implies increasing socio-spatial polarisation. So we see that in the high value coastal harbour areas. And that's not necessarily going to lead to more units, but it is probably going to lead to displacement, especially of renters. We see densification, which is probably going to lead to land fragmentation in those middle suburbs. And then we also see areas where redevelopment is just not feasible, and we've called that residualisation. And that's problematic as well because that suggests that there is no market capacity to upgrade or redevelop those buildings under the existing development regime. So to summarise, the problem with the business as usual approach, the reliance on the market to redevelop condominiums or strata is problematic. First, it results in the dissolution of the condominium corporation, which governs the property, as well as the relocation of all of the residents, and it's going to therefore damage existing social and organisational capital. Second, it potentially increases socio-spatial inequality and displacement. And third, it's likely to result in an increase in land fragmentation. So what are the alternatives, you might ask? We identified 4 in the chapter. They're not necessarily exhaustive, there's probably more. And they're also not necessarily mutually exclusive, and sometimes we see bits of different parts of them being used together. But we're drawing on our observations of practices that are already in place. So we have examples of all of these in Australia and in some cases overseas. So all of these alternatives to the market-driven knockdown and rebuild approach have the potential to deliver more equitable and sustainable housing outcomes for residents. But I want to stop and stress here that we're not simply holding up private developer-led redevelopment, understanding it as unfettered commercial interest and holding that up against owner-led redevelopment that we understand as actions in the interest of some kind of ideal condominium community or communities. The reality is a lot more complex than that. The internal governance arrangements of condominiums are influenced by owner-occupiers, investor owners, property managers, lawyers, real estate agents, and lots of other interested parties. And even amongst the owner-occupiers, motivations differ. So we see some who are more concerned with the potential for capital gains and others who are putting a greater value on their unit as a place to live. So the argument that we're making isn't that these development scenarios provide an utopian alternative to the business as usual approach, but that they provide alternative forms of redevelopment where the existing residents and property owners might be able to have a bit more control over the process. If they have more control, there's the potential for better governance outcomes for those developments than you might expect from the straight business as usual scenario. So the first alternative we called business as usual plus. And this is the recommendation that came out of our report, Renewing the Compact City, and it was the recommendation that received the most support from the industry professionals that we spoke to as part of that study. Basically, it is the business as usual approach, except that the existing owners in a development can choose to own a unit in the new development. So in our survey of owner-occupiers, there was a clear preference for some sort of value share approach compared to either just a direct collective sale to the developer or an owners corporation-led redevelopment. And that option also has the benefit of sharing both the risks and rewards of redevelopment between the existing owners and the developers. So the developer holds the redevelopment risk, but that risk is offset partially by off the plan or pre-sales to the owners who decide to take up this option. And the individual owners aren't exposed to development risk, but they still receive a newer apartment in return for agreeing to participate in the redevelopment. But redevelopment that follows this type of approach is going to require a significant value increase in the building to make it worthwhile for the developer to do, and to do by providing some units to the owners. So it's likely to result either in densification or gentrification. The second option is not-for-profit redevelopment, and this could take a bunch of different forms. And I've flagged a few of them on the slide here. So after completing our feasibility analysis for Sydney, we also reran the modelling again, but this time we removed the assumption of a developer profit to look at whether not-for-profit redevelopment would be feasible across that selection of buildings. And we found that the redevelopment of condominiums or strata, knockdown and rebuild, can be feasible across a much broader area if the requirement for a development profit is removed, and also that it can be affordable. And I'll show you the results of that in just a second. So that means that not-for-profit redevelopment could provide an important solution that local households could more easily afford. And there's different ways that could be achieved. That includes not-for-profit developers who provide more affordable or subsidised housing for purchase or rent, or government involvement in housing provision, either for sale or for rent. And the picture on the slide is of Nightingale Village, and Nightingale is a not-for-profit developer that's operating in Melbourne. It also opens up opportunities for other property ownership scenarios, including build-to-rent housing owned by a single landlord, and that might go some way towards reversing land fragmentation in redevelopment. And there's also obvious equity implications of providing subsidised and affordable rental housing, which could be really useful approach in the lower value housing markets. So the housing renewal affordability model. So we reran the model with two scenarios. The first being whether a redevelopment would be affordable to people who already live in the area. And the second, asking the same question, but without the developer profit margin. And this is the outcome of that modelling. So what you can see here is that there's not much green. So we're not seeing many places where if you were to follow the business as usual approach, a redevelopment would be affordable to the people who live there, except in those very wealthy areas where people have very high incomes. But if we take out the developer profit, this is what it looks like. And you can see that there's quite a bit more green on this slide. So we're seeing much more feasibility if we remove that assumption of a developer profit. Okay, the third alternative is where the owners become the developer and lead the redevelopment project. And this is probably the most challenging of the alternatives that we're going to discuss. Amongst the most serious challenges are agreeing on what form the redevelopment should take, securing adequate finance, and mitigating against development risk, especially during the demolition and rebuilding, i.e. when the buildings don't exist or are being rebuilt. But there are benefits, including maintaining continuity in residents when they move back in, and improving social relations amongst owners who are involved in planning the redevelopment, as well as enhancing their governance knowledge from having collectively managed a large project like this. But because they're difficult to manage, I think we haven't found many examples of this type of collective redevelopment, knockdown, rebuild of condominiums. The examples we have found, the largest ones, are in Japan. And I'm working on a project at the moment with Bruce Judd, who I think is on the call, looking at one of these redevelopments in Japan, in the city of Fukuoka. And the picture on the slide is a picture I took of one of the workshops we attended with the owner residents of that development, starting to plan out what they intended to do. But these types of projects take many years to achieve because of the difficulties, not only deciding, but also planning the redevelopment. So for example, in one redevelopment, owner-led redevelopment that was successful and was completed, one of the owners explained that they had 100 resident association meetings in a 5-year period in planning that redevelopment. That was in Tokyo. We can also expect that these types of redevelopments will result in densification, with the additional units being sold to offset the costs of demolition and reconstruction. And that certainly happened in the Japanese projects that we've been following. So the fourth and final alternative is owner-led upgrades as an alternative to knockdown and rebuild, with the owner's corporation as the developer. And this is happening in Sydney. We're aware of quite a few projects where this is occurring. So this might include substantial changes like adding units, on-site energy generation, replacing facades, adding basements and adding balconies. So far, most of the cases we're aware of are in the wealthier suburbs and indicate gentrification. And these major upgrade projects also face long project times, and they can face obstacles, including getting agreement amongst owners on what should be done and getting the necessary building and planning approvals. But just like with owner-led redevelopment, they also point to the potential benefits of governance capacity after a major upgrade project, with the owners gaining lots of experience through managing a task like this. And there's also significant environmental sustainability gains. And these projects also often turn out to be much more cost effective than a rebuild would have been. So I'm just starting a new project on these types of upgrade projects, developing a guide and associated toolkit to assist owners in the process and trying to mitigate some of that complexity and reduce the timeframes that are involved in these projects. So I'm working on that with Sandra Loschke, who I saw has joined the call, and also our new PhD student, Alison, who just joined us this week. So to conclude, in this presentation, I've spoken about the drivers of redevelopment, including the failures of many condominiums to adequately fund and manage maintenance and repairs. That means that owners are facing high costs of essential repairs and upgrades, which provides an important trigger for discussions about redevelopment. Other pressures to redevelop come from planning authorities who want to increase density, as well as developers looking for speculative development opportunities. I've also spoken about some of the complexities in multi-owned property when it comes to deciding whether and how to redevelop. These challenges of collective decision-making are one reason why the most common approach is collective sale to a developer and subsequent for-profit redevelopment. And I've talked about the potential negative implications of that business as usual approach for the governance capacity of new condominiums, for social equity across cities, and for the potential of future development in view of increasing land fragmentation, making everything much more complex. So hopefully, I've also persuaded you that this is a major issue, and that the challenges of redeveloping condominiums or strata title has far-reaching implications for the social sustainability of cities. This means it's got important implications for planners, developers, designers, governments, and everyone else, really. Given the problems associated with the business as usual approach, I think it's important to think about what the alternatives might be. We've considered 4 here, but there's likely to be plenty more. And finally, just to make the point, property owners are unlikely to be able to do this on their own. There needs to be a role for government at different levels to provide support. And they're also, all of these alternatives rely on external professionals. And I think that presents a huge professional opportunity and one that's largely unrealised at the moment. So it's not going to be easy to realise these alternatives, but I think we should be doing everything we can to make them possible. And if you're interested in learning more about any of the projects that I mentioned, there are the links. So thank you very much, and I think we've allowed plenty of time for questions. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Hazel. That was brilliant. And we already have like a couple of questions on the chat, so we can start with them. So the first one is from Michael asking about the Japanese building. What's the trigger for the Japanese building study?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So the trigger for the Muramidanshi estate renewal is essentially that there's two. One is that the buildings are aging, and the other is that the residents are aging. So because the residents are aging, the buildings don't have lifts, and the residents are keen to have improved accessibility to the higher floors. But also the buildings are aging, and there are some substantial costs coming up in the future for renovations and upgrades. And so the owners were talking about whether it might make more sense to put their energies into a redevelopment rather than an upgrade. Yeah. Question from Ed. Would you expect that spatiality to change in a COVID world? Oh, you mean in terms of the different submarkets, Ed, and the spread across the city?
In terms of the feasibility, because your modeling was done before all of this, right? And now the profit margin, if the plus model is included, that would be very different.
Yeah, it would be very different. And also, I mean, one of the big things is that we know before COVID that a lot of the purchases of new units were investors, and a lot of them were also overseas investors. Whereas now what I'm being told by people in the development industry is that they're seeing a turn towards owner-occupiers buying new units because they can, because they've got less competition from those investors. So yeah, we are seeing quite a change in the market. I wouldn't want to predict what that means other than, yes, it will change. But then it's a question of how long does that change last, you know? Will we go back to the previous normal? Question from Susan. Hi, Susan. Susan's from England.
Hi, I'll just unmute to say hello from England.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, so the question is about the reduction in vote and how much difference in practice these voting majorities have and how important is it? That's a great question. So what I'm hearing is that the fact that the vote has changed has meant that a lot more people are talking about their redevelopment possibilities. So even if they're thinking about doing a major upgrade like option 4 that I presented, before the change in laws actually only required a 75% agreement. But since the change in laws, people are talking about the possibility of knocking down and rebuilding, and that's leading them to talk also about these possibilities of upgrade, which require the same percentage vote. Also, what we're hearing is that so the change in the percentage vote to 75% is significant, but it also came with it a whole process for managing that redevelopment with less than unanimous consent. What we're hearing is that those buildings that are redeveloping aren't using that process. They're finding other workarounds to redevelop because they think that that process is too restricting and time consuming. So we're actually seeing different kinds of contractual and legal workarounds. But the fact that the process is there means that people are talking about the issue and looking for the workarounds, even if they're not actually using the process. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, sorry, look, I'm going to take my video on as well, just so I can say hi, because it's weird having a conversation when you're only talking to blank screens. But thank you so much. I mean, we haven't even started on this journey yet here, but it's really interesting to know what you're saying is happening on the ground. And is that in any of your publications, or is that just like you're sort of in your mind because of the studies you've been doing?
No, it's not in any of my publications. Yeah,
okay.
It will be eventually.
Yeah. Okay, great.
It's not yet.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, okay. Michael, are you seeing any innovative funding from third parties, including banks? We're actually seeing innovative funding in Australia. So in Australia, we have some companies that specialise in funding to condominium corporations or strata corporations, and they provide unsecured loans at roughly double your normal kind of home loan interest rate to support these projects. So that last project that I showed of the redevelopment of the big white building, it's supported by the largest of one of those loans so far in Australia. I can't remember how many millions of dollars, but it's a multi-million-dollar loan from a lender. So there is a lending option there, but it's quite expensive. Susan, Tracy. Obviously, government policy levers could better support such changes. Do you have a view on what's most important to help? Yeah, there's a bunch of kind of tax issues that need to be sorted out, and we talk about those in the Renewing the Compact City report. I think it's really, the most important thing is just for government to recognise that this is on the cards, and I think we're lucky, I guess, in New South Wales that they have. But I think there's also the possibility for government to be involved in some of these alternatives, you know, right down to kind of planning approvals. So we see for the upgrade projects that projects often get stuck at the planning approvals stage. And it would be good to be a bit more flexible, I think, around that, given the environmental and the social and the economic benefits of doing that rather than knocking down and rebuilding. I might go to Bruce because he's got his hand up.
Hazel, toward the end, it's a bit of a follow-up question to your last answer. Towards the end, you mentioned the need for more government involvement, more government action. Can you be a bit more precise about what kind? Would it be legislation or guidelines or what?
Well, there's lots. So if we're talking about the not-for-profit redevelopment option, then we might be talking about government stepping into that space in terms of either directly providing housing or supporting particular outcomes. So we have seen in New South Wales, for example, support of build-to-rent developments, but perhaps that could be better tied to affordability outcomes than it has been so far. We're talking about yeah, I guess there's so many different things. We're talking about, as I said before, the local planning regulations. We're talking about tax implications and really just working through all of that, but also providing advice and information on what people can be doing and what their rights are, what the risks are, how they can mitigate against those.
Thank you.
All right, where am I up to? Rupa, would such renewal of condominium buildings have implications for structural issues arising from redevelopment in neighbouring buildings? Yes, it would. In congested areas of CBD in the city locations which are likely to have road. Yeah, absolutely. Rupa, do you want to say a bit more about that? Do you want to give a bit of context for our international attendees?
Sure. Hi, Hazel. Thanks. A really interesting presentation. We've had the issue of mascot towers and opal towers in Olympic Park where defects in those apartment buildings emerged because of construction in neighbouring buildings. So that just prompted me to ask this question, whether from a practical aspect, how would that be managed? And as you mentioned, such renewal is likely to have gentrification impacts with possibly, flight away from the area amongst owner-occupiers and renters as well, as prices and rents rise. Perhaps if there is some sort of compensation or I don't know, if there's government levers that might entice people, give them that confidence. From my research, there's a real hesitancy amongst buyers to purchase off the plan, for example, given the defects that have arisen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, kind of on the opening slide, there's a whole nother part to this, which is, well, what are we actually building now, and what are the implications of that for the future? But as you say, what we're building now, if we're knocking down and rebuilding, is replacement buildings. And I mean, I've just been doing some interviews with strata managers about sustainability in strata buildings. One of the strata managers said something to me which I thought was really interesting. He said, if we look at the older strata buildings in Sydney, they generally have the capacity to be upgraded. But if we look at what's being built now, there's no upgrade capacity. He said, things like, the buildings are going in, but the electricity systems are at capacity, so it's not possible to include electric vehicle charging stations in the basement. There's no additional space anywhere. The foundations wouldn't allow for the addition of new units on the roof. So it's some of the options that we're looking at, where we're looking at redevelopment without knocking down and rebuilding, are just not feasible. So then if the physical building doesn't allow for upgrading, which is the type of building we're building now, then your only option is to knock down and rebuild. And in order to make that affordable, you either need to displace people by making it more luxurious, or you need to build at even higher densities and you end up in even more of a pickle down the line. So it really is about thinking about what the future has in store for us, given that we're having trouble already now, and yet the pre-1990s buildings tend to be more favourable to redevelopment than what we're putting up right now. Don't know if that kind of partly answers the question. Thanks. Thanks, Laura, for your comments in the chat. That's great. Martin asks, are you seeing any link between cladding remediation and redevelopment or building extension? I'm not, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Laura, is that something that's come up in the defects project?
Hi, Hazel. Only I haven't seen any sort of clear data on it. I've certainly heard people sort of saying, oh, we expect that people might do this, but I haven't, I'm not aware of people sort of that being a widespread thing. And I think often the costs associated with cladding remediation mean that people aren't thinking about adding on to that. They're just trying to work out how they can make the bare minimum that they need to do happen.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the other interesting things is, again, with these interviews that I'm doing at the moment, I've been wondering whether people are pairing these kinds of major upgrades with sustainability initiatives, and I'm finding actually often they're not. They're just doing what they have to do in order to make the building habitable, not going that extra mile. So actually, in answer to the questions before about what the government could do, some incentives to kind of, I guess, value add at that point would be quite good. So, you know, if you're going to do an owner-led redevelopment, perhaps there could be a government incentive to, in your redevelopment, ensure that what you're building is has a better building performance than your standard development unit.
Hi, Hazel, it's Rupa again. Have you looked at research on how older commercial buildings are redeveloped and sustainability elements are added to those buildings?
No, I haven't, but it would be a really interesting comparison, I agree. Okay. Susan again. On cladding, some sites in England are pondering whether adding floors can help fund necessary remediation. Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing that in those resident-led substantial upgrades. They often include the addition of new units, sometimes on the roof and sometimes by digging out under the building and putting additional units on the ground. So it's certainly something that can be considered. Bill. Oh, you're muted, Bill.
Yeah, okay. I think there was a really good presentation, actually, Hazel, and you really summarised quite difficult bits of analysis there very well. I think one of the, just bear in mind, just for the rest of everybody, one of the reasons why we did this project was this kind of challenge. It was called Renewing the Compact City. In other words, this is already a relatively, for our city anyway, a relatively compact form, and the whole issue is around renewing that compact form. What we found, obviously, is that you can't do it unless you increase density, basically, or you price it right out of the market. So we're building cities now, and this is one of their sort of underlying concerns. We're building cities increasing density, and yet we're building a product, a form of housing, which is increasingly difficult to get rid of. And if you do get rid of it, you have to make it worthwhile those who are going to get rid of it by allowing them, presumably, to build higher and higher. So you've got this sort of rather odd process now happening. Densifications. How high do you have to go next time you want to redevelop a block of flats? You know, if you've got a 40-story block of flats, where'd you go with that? You know, 80 stories. So I think this is kind of a real message here about how we manage cities in the future, and what we're doing now will have a real impact on perhaps how we can retool them, reshape them, redevelop them in the future. So that was one of the sort of underlying, and you pointed that out, Hazel. I think this is sort of a fundamental message here about what we're currently doing in our cities, not just in Australia, of course, but I mean, there are very many more denser cities elsewhere.
Thanks, Bill. I'll just answer Tonia's question. So she's asking, who are owners corporations reaching out for input? Are architects the first stop? I think they're reaching out to all sorts of different people. I got an email just recently, actually, from a strata manager who'd been approached by an owner who wanted to do a collective sale, asking where she should go for advice on that. So she came to me, and then I forwarded her on to a consultant in Sydney who's providing advice on these types of things. So there are consultants who are beginning to specialise in it. There are architects who draw up designs and options. There's also some for the kind of upgrade projects, there's remedial builders that are specialising in these upgrade projects. So it's kind of a, I guess on my second last slide, I was talking about the opportunities for professionals. I think there really is a huge professional opportunity here across a bunch of different skill sets to help owners to manage and navigate through the complexities of this kind of thing, so that they do have an alternative to business as usual if they want, or at least if they want to explore it. Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question.
I think we'll have like time for one more. There's none. We can wrap up early. Like we had like 4 minutes early. That's pretty good.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Like this has been one of the sessions with the highest attendance. I think we got around like 50 people attending today. So which is good news. Like since we started the seminar and it's been like going good. Thanks everyone for coming for the seminar, and it's been like a good valuable discussion today. So we had like 20 minutes of solid discussion as well following the presentation. So I would like to thank everyone on behalf of CFRC, and thank you, Hazel, for like brilliant presentation.
Thanks very much, everyone, and thanks for the excellent questions.
Yes. Cool. I think we can officially close the meeting.
All right. Happy weekend, everyone.